very good evening to all our viewers and welcome to yet another edition of Biz in Focus. Multilateral trade pact in 20 years and Sri Lanka's efforts to get onto this bandwagon of the 11 Pacific Rim countries. How successful is Sri Lanka going to be in doing so? We'll be discussing about this exclusively today on Biz Focus and much more, and all the trends that are in the economic sector. And if you need to ask any questions or if you need to post your comments and views, you can simply use a hashtag BizInFocus, using our Twitter handle, that is at Newsfirst_EN. And to speak about those issues today, we've got Dr. Razin Sali with us, and he is the president of the Institute of Policy Studies. A very good evening to you and welcome, Dr. Razin.
Thank you.
Today, we just started the program with the TPP, and that's been one of the hot button topics in the recent past, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, how important do you think is this for us, for our government and the economy?
I think it's very important to consider because the TPP, which unites 12 countries, including two really big economies, the United States and Japan, it accounts for almost 40% of world GDP and up to 1/3 of world trade. So Sri Lanka, whether in or out, will be impacted by the TPP.
What are the negative outlooks you've got about this whole agreement? As in
negative in what sense?
Negative as in economically.
Well, it's discriminatory. All free trade agreements, unlike the agreements in the WTO, discriminate against members who are outside the club. Some clubs are very small, they just have 2 or 3 members. This one has 12. It's a so-called mega regional agreement. It's supposed to liberalize trade within the club, but it doesn't liberalize trade outside the club. So outsiders might be negatively affected, perhaps significantly, because trade will be diverted inside the club and foreign investment with it. That's an important consideration for Sri Lanka, because if Sri Lanka stays outside the TPP, then it might well lose business, not least to a country like Vietnam, in garments and other sectors, because Vietnam, when the TPP will be ratified, will have duty-free access to the United States, to Japan and elsewhere, while Sri Lanka won't.
But speaking about Vietnam, they're the biggest competitors in the apparel industry with us, right? But their import, the fabric and material, comes directly from China, but China is not a part of the TPP. How exactly is it going to work?
Well, if you look at the provisions on textiles and apparel in the TPP, which are very complicated, on the one hand, it provides duty-free access. On the other hand, you have to source your yarn from within the TPP membership, which means that Vietnam might well have to find different sources for yarn, not China, maybe more expensive sources. So that is yes, a downside and a cost, but probably for Vietnam it will be far outweighed by the benefits it will get from duty-free access to big markets, particularly to the United States. That's relevant for Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka will lose a considerable advantage vis-à-vis Vietnam, because it won't have this duty-free access, especially to the vitally important US market. Now, the bigger and the more efficient companies will get round this by establishing more production in Vietnam. That's to say MAS, Brandix, Hydromanis, maybe 1 or 2 others. They're already doing that. They might well accelerate it and establish more local content, local production in Vietnam, so that they can qualify for this duty-free access. That might be okay for these companies. These companies have withstood pressures from the global market before, but it's not necessarily a good thing for the garments industry overall in Sri Lanka, because of course the garments industry is much more than just 3 companies. and so other companies, small and medium-sized exporters, will stand to lose considerably vis-à-vis Vietnam. That's one reason among several, why Sri Lanka should study the TPP carefully and evaluate options about joining it.
Now, enhancing tax revenues has been one of the vital ways of generating revenue or stimulating growth for us in Sri Lanka. And the government has been doing this for a long time. Do you think the government has to resort to a plan B in generating finances, revenues?
Well, successive governments have been very bad at managing the country's public finances. And what has happened over time is that tax revenues have been depleted. Sri Lanka has one of the lowest rates of revenue collection to GDP in the world. It's down to about 10% now. While at the same time, governments have spent like there's no tomorrow on all sorts of subsidies and transfer payments to vote banks, as it were. So there's been this widening mismatch between tax collection and public spending. The last government was extremely bad at this. It spent like there was no tomorrow, all on borrowing, including increasing reliance on foreign borrowing, while its taxation policy was extremely ad hoc, and the tax take continued to dwindle. Now, I had hoped that with the change of government in January, that there would be more responsible economic policy making. That hope has not turned out to be the case. There was one very bad budget in February, succeeding the last Rajapaksa budget, which was also very bad. The Prime Minister's economic policy statement indicated something else. It indicated that the Prime Minister was certainly aware of the dire state of the country's finances, and that this would lead to a disastrous crisis if not corrected. But this budget, the most recent budget, has been more in line with previous budgets. It has been extremely complacent on public finances, on both revenue and expenditure. It was done in an extremely ad hoc fashion, and there have been various budget supplementaries, which of course has happened with previous budgets, that have further gutted revenue and perhaps increases the prospect of a financial crisis sometime during the course of next year. Now, one can apportion blame in many quarters. The government has certainly not got its decision-making act together, but the problem lies first and foremost with the Finance Ministry and the Minister of Finance. And that's a problem that has to be sorted out.
Well, what are the loopholes in the budget? Answers after this short commercial break. Welcome back. Well, Dr. Sali, I asked the viewers earlier, what are the loopholes in the budget? What do you think are the loopholes in the budget 2016?
One can go into lots of individual details, but the main problem is that this habit of giving tax concessions to sector after sector after sector continues with this budget. That only further depletes government revenue. And it's all a very, very ad hoc process. The other big problem, the general problem, is the ratio between direct and indirect taxation. Now, direct taxes, in terms of the ratio, should increase considerably, in line with what happens abroad. But what this budget does is actually further deteriorate the ratio between indirect and direct taxes. So it means much more reliance on indirect taxes, which are very, very inefficient. What needs to happen quickly, and this has to be the Prime Minister's initiative, because the Finance Minister seems incapable of doing this, is to recast the budget so that measures are undertaken to restore sanity to the public finances. What Sri Lanka needs pretty urgently is a big tax reform. Now, that should have many elements. You can't keep giving tax concession after tax concession. You have to increase the revenue intake as a proportion of GDP, and you have to have much more reliance on direct taxes as opposed to indirect taxes. And finally, what Sri Lanka needs above all else to improve the incentives for investment and productive activity, both foreign investors and domestic investors, is to vastly simplify the tax system. What you have is, with all these little measures for this sector and that sector and this business and that business, is a very complicated system which makes doing business that much more difficult. It deters investment, it deters employment. That needs to change. Why does all of this need to happen urgently? It's because the country is lurching towards a big crisis. Global interest rates are on the rise. There's already huge foreign debt exposure. During the course of next year, most likely, with the increase in US interest rates and with less confidence with capital going to emerging markets, the price of actually servicing Sri Lanka's foreign debt is going to increase considerably. But the money isn't there to pay for it. So you need to get your tax side of things much more in order to withstand that shock. That's why it's absolutely urgent. The government also needs to tackle, at least in the medium term, what's happening on the expenditure side. Now, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore once famously said that Sri Lankan elections and Sri Lankan budgets are about an auction of non-existent resources. This has been happening for the last 50 or 60 years. And the country then perennially needs to be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund or by China or whoever. That has got to stop. One way of trying to do that is to correct things on the revenue side. And the other way of doing that is to restore sanity to the expenditure side. So serious decisions have to be made about how the government spends its money, because at the moment it's spending not only too much, but also spending it very inefficiently. There has to be much more efficiency with government spending. Now, those decisions on the expenditure side are probably politically much more difficult than on the tax side. And they will probably have to be spread out over this parliamentary term. Many of them probably won't get through politically in the next year or so. But other measures on the tax side can probably be pushed through with the right will and leadership in the next year, indeed in the next 3 to 6 months. And that's something that should be done.
So, Dr. Sali, could you speak about the downside of obtaining loans from these institutions?
Well, it's a begging bowl culture, it's a dependency culture, and it's also a way of not facing up to a reckoning, to facing up to sober reality, but to postponing it all the time, or to use a different metaphor, to kick the can down the road. Sri Lanka's politicians, responding to popular pressures, constantly spend too much and mess up the tax system in the process. And then when a crisis arrives, they go with the begging bowl to the IMF or to other donors and expect to be bailed out. Now, this has happened several times before. The last time it happened was in 2009. The IMF bailed Sri Lanka out with a loan of $2.6 billion, I think it was, in return for what the IMF calls conditionality. In other words, certain conditions were imposed to try and restore sanity to the way Sri Lanka conducts its economic policy, particularly on taxation and expenditure. So the last government pretended to reform, but it was never serious about it. It came into line with IMF targets by putting a lot of money off the balance sheet, by doing lots of creative smoke and mirrors accounting. And the IMF played along with this, broadly speaking. And so the situation got worse once again under the last government, and has got even worse under the present government. Hence now talk once again of Sri Lanka going back to the IMF. Now, Sri Lanka may well need an IMF loan sometime during the course of next year, but I would make 2 points in response to that probability. Firstly, there's a lot of very loose, irresponsible talk about very casually getting money from the IMF without having conditions imposed on Sri Lanka. The finance minister has indulged in some of this talk himself, which I think is very irresponsible. And that kind of talk has got to stop, because not only does it undermine confidence domestically, it also sours, even poisons relations with the IMF, and it's very embarrassing internationally and domestically to hear such sort of talk, which is utter nonsense. Secondly, the government needs to get its act in order well before going to the IMF to ask formally for a loan, and well before negotiating an IMF program. If it leaves it to the last moment, say into the second quarter of next year, a crisis might well blow up. Interest rates for Sri Lanka's debt servicing will go through the roof, and then the costs of rectifying the situation with or without an IMF loan would be much, much higher than they would be if precautionary measures were taken well in advance. Yeah. Right. Hence the importance, as I said earlier, of undertaking those corrective measures on the tax side in particular.
Dr. Sali, does it mean now adhering to these conditions means complying to neoliberalist views of these institutions?
No, I think that's... many people make that argument. It's a cheap shot, and it's also very misleading. This term neoliberal is bandied about very loosely. Most people don't know what it means. The IMF and the World Bank and other international organizations are certainly not neoliberal. They're not rabidly free market. They don't want to tear down government and make it into something insignificant. Quite the contrary. Their broad orientation is perhaps more social democratic than neoliberal. If you look at the IMF in particular, its loan book, the way it's actually intervened in some countries, including Greece fairly recently, the way it's actually eased up on its conditions for giving loans, shows that it has become much less neoliberal over the last 15 or 20 years than it was, say, in the 1990s. Not that it was ever purely neoliberal. And I think one could say something similar with other international organizations. In a truly neoliberal world, there would be no IMF, there would be no World Bank, there would be no foreign aid.
So do you think that Bolivia is an exception in terms of how Cochabamba was completely down with the water crisis because of the restrictions that was imposed by the World Bank at that time? I'm not aware of, I don't know of that example. I know of various examples where the World Bank and the IMF have imposed certain conditions. The IMF was taken to task for imposing very strict conditions on Indonesia when Indonesia was very much at the heart of the Asian crisis in 1997-98. Some of those conditions were probably unnecessary. They went into far too much micro detail about how the country should be run. And since then, the IMF has tried to stick more to so-called macroeconomic policy, rather than getting into the details of microeconomic policy. My issue with the IMF over the last
roughly since the Asian crisis, is that its conditions for giving out loans on macroeconomic policy have become too loose and too much dictated by politics among the major players than by objective economic conditions. The World Bank, sure, the World Bank is in the business of lending on micro projects, unlike the IMF, and I think it's fair enough to insist on conditions for lending money, just as any bank manager would. Why should countries that have sinned by getting things wrong domestically go to these international organizations and expect money in return for nothing? That doesn't make commercial sense. It doesn't make policy sense either.
Well, will Sri Lanka recover before a possible financial crisis? We'll have more answers to this after this short commercial break. Well, Dr. Sali, TPP was shrouded in a lot of secrecy in the recent past, right? And there's a lot of question that has arisen in terms of the intellectual property rights.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think Sri Lanka will lose it? And also if you can speak a little bit about entrepreneurship, or whether growth will be stunted in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Well, if we take the intellectual property rights question first, the provisions in the TPP are pretty strong, as they are in other US free trade agreements. They go beyond the provisions in the WTO. So if Sri Lanka were to join, it would have to significantly strengthen its intellectual property protection on patents, on copyrights, and on trademarks in particular. Now, there has to be a careful cost-benefit analysis done on this. There may well be some costs. The price of some essential medicines which are on prescription and not generics might go up as a result. All I would say is that if you look at the track record of what's happened with other US free trade agreements on intellectual property protection, a lot of the accusations about disaster happening, about prices going through the roof, and about much restricted access to essential medicines, that hasn't come to pass for various reasons. There are safeguards in these agreements. Most drugs, 80 to 90% of them, are generics anyway. So I think some of this talk is pretty alarmist, and basically it has a kind of anti-market motive to it, and underlying all that, perhaps an anti-American motive to it as well. The other point to bear in mind is that you have to look at, and this relates to the second part of your question, is that you have to look at these trade agreements as a package, not just in terms of isolated elements. So if there are going to be any costs on the intellectual property side, you've got to weigh them up against potential benefits in other aspects of the agreement. And in other aspects of the agreement, there are many potential benefits for Sri Lanka. It will have much more access to export markets because the duties will go down to zero on 90 to 95% of goods quickly. It will become potentially more attractive as a destination for services and for foreign investment. And all of that would help plug Sri Lanka into global value chains, because it's not in these global value chains except garments. And global value chains are among the biggest drivers of productivity, employment, and growth in the world economy. And the final point I would make is that the strength of these rules of the TPP might well help to open up the domestic economy to competition in a way that other free trade agreements don't do. So the free trade agreement with India and the one that's being negotiated with China are very weak in comparison. They will make little difference to the way the Sri Lankan economy operates. But the pro-competition rules that the TPP has on paper might well help reinforce pro-competition reforms that hopefully the government will undertake here. If that happens, then it will mean a net increase in entrepreneurship, not a decrease in entrepreneurship. So that's the potential gains that could come from the TPP. But before making any definitive conclusions about it, it has to be studied carefully from Sri Lanka's perspective, a cost-benefit analysis done, and then the government will have options to see what can be done. Now, the Institute of Policy Studies is doing such a study over the next 3 months. It will consult the private sector along the way, and hopefully the government will then have a clearer idea of what's in this for Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Dr. Sali. It was a pleasure having you with us on the show today. But during the discussion, Dr. Sali spoke about how tax concessions should be decreased and the budget should be recast, tax revenues should be increased, as well as tax systems should be reformed. Well, we will have an exclusive discussion next week as well. In the meantime, you can simply write your comments or even questions using our hashtag biz1st by typing our Twitter handle, that is at Newsfirst_en. We'll have more discussion, more discourse next week. Stay tuned.